I'm Nipa Banerjee from the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to all. On behalf of the hosts of this event, the Center for International Policy Studies, the Fragile States Research Network, and the Asian Studies Network, I welcome the audience and our speakers to today's discussion of the way forward options in Afghanistan. The international community fought the Taliban insurgency for 20 years with blood and money, investing trillions of dollars and losing thousands of soldiers. However, Afghanistan's Taliban swept to power on August 15, 2021. A year after, Afghanistan is at a crossroads, facing poverty and unprecedented socioeconomic, political, and governance and security challenges. These challenges partially predate the takeover of Kabul on August 15, 2021, but have worsened since then. The economic downturn has driven millions of people into deep poverty and hunger, while foreign aid to a country over-dependent on overseas assistance has slowed to a trickle. Today, the Taliban struggles to govern with multiple sanctions imposed on the country and remains isolated internationally, primarily due to their neglect of human rights, especially women's rights. However, the international community claims to remain committed to the Afghan people and to stability, prosperity, and sustainable peace in Afghanistan. The international community stresses that a regime that tramples on human rights cannot be recognized, but the people must not be forgotten. Ordinary Afghans' basic needs and human rights must be protected. What options are available to enable the international community to address such commitment? For instance, pressuring the Taliban for governance reforms addressing human rights has been mentioned as an option. What does pressure imply? What are the means of applying pressure? Today, we present a panel of experts on Afghanistan to discuss the available options. Dr. Roland Paris of our university will chair the dialogue session with the experts and the question and answer period with the audience. I present Roland Paris first. Dr. Roland Paris, holding degrees from highly acclaimed universities in North America and the UK, is a professor of international affairs and director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is an associate fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. He was the founding director of the Center for International Policy Studies, CIPS, which is hosting today's event. He has served in several advisory roles in the government, including as Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. He served as a professor and researcher in highly acclaimed educational institutions and think tanks, and is well known for his advisory roles with professional institutions and organizations. Noteworthy is his role in a 10-member group of international experts advising the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. His research on the international security, civil conflicts, peace building, and Canadian and American foreign policy has appeared in leading academic outlets and earned several prizes. He provides regular analysis and commentary on the international affairs for national and international media. I present Fatima Gailani next, our first speaker today. Fatima Gailani was one of Afghanistan's 21 negotiators involved in peace talks with the Taliban, bringing decades of relevant knowledge and experience to the negotiating table. She was a member of the commission that drafted the current Afghan constitution, one of the most progressive national documents in the region. Gailani participated in the 2001 Bonn Conference, the emergency lawyer jirga that mandated the transitional administration, and the 2004 constitutional lawyer jirga. During the 1980s, she was a spokesperson for the Afghan Mujahideen. From 2004 to 2016, Gailani was the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society, AIHRC. Dr. Najim Dost is next. He has a PhD in international studies from the University of Denver and an MPA in international development from Harvard University. He has over a decade of experience studying and researching international development issues in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, the United States, and Canada. He is currently working for Canada's Defense Department, DND, and is a research associate with our CIPS. I present Dr. Arne Strand. Arne Strand is a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, CMI, in Norway. Arne Strand's research, studies, and publications closely relate to issues relevant to Afghanistan. He earned his expertise in Afghanistan through academic studies and work experience of close to 10 years in Afghanistan. His research covers fragile states, peace building, post-war recovery, migration, and assisted return, humanitarian and development assistance, and anti-corruption, all areas of importance for Afghanistan. His recent publications cover support for community-driven development and the choice between confrontation and creative compromises with the Taliban administration is very interesting. I present Dr. Sima Samar now, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, renowned human rights advocate, and an identified global influential female figure. Dr. Sima Samar has dedicated her life to public service, humanitarian work, and women's empowerment. From 2002 to 2019, she served as the chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. She was the vice president of the interim administration of the transitional government of Afghanistan and was the very first minister of women's affairs. Dr. Sima Samar served in several internal bodies, including the UN. Her commitment to her community is evident through her NGO, Shuhada's work in operating schools and hospitals for the needy and skills training programs for women, the latter promoting women's economic empowerment. Sima Samar has tirelessly advocated for the world's underrepresented and marginalized groups of women, children, and minorities, with the firm belief that respect for human rights and human dignity, equality between the people, and access to justice will change the conditions in the ground and help in conflict reduction. Thank you. Roland, I request you to start the dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Nipa, and thank you everyone who has joined us. I'm really delighted to be able to moderate today's discussion, not least because of the quality of the panelists that we have joining us today from many different points, from the UK, from Norway, from the United States, and with their direct experience and long interest in the case of the Arne as a researcher and the others as even more deeply connected to the country, of course. This, I think, will be a very interesting discussion. It also comes a year after the painful events in Afghanistan that I think that many of us are still reeling from, the Taliban sweeping to power, the chaotic rush for the exits, by Western countries, and an ongoing concern about what happens next for the country, for the people, and what kinds of options are there for dealing with the Taliban government and trying to support the people of Afghanistan, and the dilemmas that are involved in trying to identify and implement the options that might be available. And the options are the subject of today's talk. So how we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask each of the speakers just to make introductory remarks, and then I'm going to come back with a few questions for them. I'm also going to invite them to respond to each other's comments. And then we will turn to questions. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you wish to ask a question, then just type your question into that screen. And when we turn to questions from the audience, then I'll be delighted to turn to and hopefully turn to many of the questions that you might ask. You can enter those questions, by the way, at any time. So without further ado, let me turn first to Fatima Gailani, and welcome, Ms. Gailani. And please, why don't you start off by giving your opening remarks on what the situation is and what are the options available?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nipa. Thank you, Dr. Paris, for this opportunity, and salam to the list of the panelists. It's an honor to be in this meeting. People that I have today next to me, I've always looked up to them and admire their work, honesty, and their dedication for Afghanistan. For me, the most important thing is that what did go wrong? I mean, just earlier we were talking among ourselves that never in the history of Afghanistan so much help and so much support had come to Afghanistan that we had financially and in personnel and in expertise around us for the last 20 years, and then such a shameful and disastrous end to it. We cannot build or even hope for the future if we don't stop the mistakes of the past. Was it really a military defeat? I don't think so. I strongly believe that it was a political bankruptcy, a political defeat and a political collapse, which ended into a situation that there was no willing for the people of Afghanistan to have a hope for a government, or especially the defensive forces of Afghanistan gave up and actually didn't fight and surrendered. The other thing, which is we cannot wait, I'm sorry that I'm jumping from one branch to another because there are so many things that we have to address today that I just want to highlight those that I'm interested to talk about and to discuss it. The other thing is that the education. So much money was spent in Afghanistan. Let's be honest about it with ourselves. The education of the 20 years with millions, billions and billions of dollars for education came. Was it only in the cities or was it everywhere in Afghanistan? We know that quite a lot of areas in Afghanistan that they didn't have education facilities for girls or for the boys. But in the cities, in the rural areas, I mean the urban area, never in the history of Afghanistan we had so many well facilities, whether but mostly private and some governmental, but mostly private, that gave opportunity to young people in Afghanistan to be educated, and especially for women. Never in the history of Afghanistan we had so many well-educated women. So it was a huge difference between urban and rural, and there was a big difference between a private education and governmental education. If we looked for tomorrow, we have to stop repeating the mistake of the past. From the last 44 years, we keep on, and we are repeating the mistakes that we put Afghanistan in a situation very similar to the situation that we are today, if not worse. But are we aware of it? Do we think about it? So let's think about that. Let's take those issues and build upon it for the future. In the future, as Nepal said, that never in the history of Afghanistan so much poverty and humanitarian crisis happened. I was the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society. I have seen poverty. I have seen war. I have seen all kinds of disasters. But what I'm seeing today, the poverty, lack of war, it is not just the poor who has become poorer. It is the middle class which is gone to poverty. It is middle class which is vanishing. The ones that are well-to-do, they are not inside the country anyway. So how could we balance that? It is true that when humanitarian help goes inside Afghanistan, some weight is lifted from the shoulder of the Taliban. This is very true. But don't forget that the lack of recognition of the country also harms the people of Afghanistan. So how do we prevent a haste recognition? How to be built upon it? And for that, we need to have a proper, united approach. I don't see a united approach even now with our Western friends who are actually paying and sending humanitarian help. Politically, I don't see that they have an organized and unified approach to make it clear to Taliban that what is next and how it will come to be a recognition. I personally believe that if Taliban wants to do something, although it is nice that we can see voices within the Taliban coming up regarding criticizing the way the women are treated or the education of women and all that. But this is not enough. We need more approach. One question that I have from my own country people and also from our Western friends, are we looking for sensation or we want to really help the situation? Are we going to politicize everything so much that we will leave it in a state that there is no way walk back from it and just shout about things? Or we really want to change the situation for women inside? If we want to change the situation for men, women, men, and everyone inside, we have to have a proper approach of diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy, plus pressure, yes, but not a sensation. Some people thrive on some sensations, and this should stop. At the end, I just want to say that I refuse to give up hope. I go inside Afghanistan, I see people. The people inside Afghanistan, they don't have an option of giving up hope. They are hoping, but they do look to us, the Afghans outside the country, and those people who claim who are friends of Afghanistan, to make it right this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a very rich set of ideas, and there's so much to unpack, as you say, in what you just presented. Maybe I could just ask you one follow-up question relating to one point that you just raised. You said that the issue of recognizing the Taliban government, there needs to be a united approach, and you're not seeing that. But what should the approach be? What should the approach be to recognizing or not recognizing the Taliban government?
I go back one step backward. I go back to Doha. In Doha, I saw it with my own eyes that the message that we are, Mr. President Ghani, actually we are leaving. You have no choice but go towards a peaceful agreement or a political dialogue. That was not very clear. It was wishy-washy, and they were scared to spell it out. And I saw with Taliban and with us, the message was not the same. The message was not the same. So one side believed that the NATO is leaving, Americans are leaving, and we can win militarily. But it was not spelled out to them that a military option will have these consequences. You will not be recognized immediately. You have to do a set of things. So no one was encouraged for a proper political dialogue, and that peace dialogue, which was put on the platform there, didn't have a proper support. Taliban had one set of illusions, and the Afghan government has a totally another set of illusions, and neither side were thinking about the real situation. And that's the consequences is paid by the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you. And as we turn to our next presenter panelist, Najim Dost, let me just suggest to all the panelists that you have an opportunity not just to present your initial thoughts, but to begin responding to some of the points that you've already heard, including that one question I asked about what is the recognition strategy going forward. Over to you, Najim Dost, please.
Thank you, Roland. Thanks for having me, and great to be here. The question of future prospects for Afghanistan is a difficult one. So I'm going to start, if we were in a setting where we could all talk to each other, I was going to ask you to raise your hands if you think that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a good idea, virtually. I don't see any hands, at least in the panel that I can watch, and I'm not surprised. And then I would follow up with another question. Now raise your hand if you think that the overthrow of the Soviet-backed government in 1992 was a good idea. I doubt anybody would raise their hands on that either, right? Because we know what happened afterwards. That was the beginning of the Civil War. That was 1992, right? And the history of Afghanistan, there is no shortage of these kinds of regime changes. If we go back to the times before that, we had monarchy, and then we flirted with a little bit of democracy and republic for a little bit, and then we had communism, and then we had the Mujahideen. If I were to stereotype, we went from suits and ties to turbans and beards, and then 1996 we had the Taliban. More turbans and even longer beards. And then, of course, the last 20 years, we had a little bit of mix of both. We had some of those in the previous regime and administration, which changed the way they appeared, and we had others with the same appearance. Bad guys became good guys became bad guys. We still had some ties and suits. And then, of course, 2021, and we have, it's an empirical question, Taliban, of course, but is it Taliban 2.0 or not? I myself doubt it. All that to say that I don't think it is about what we like or dislike about the regime. I don't think it is about what is good or what is bad. I think we all know what is good and what is bad. It is common sense. It is ingrained in human imagination, what is good and what is bad to a large extent. I think what is the real problem is how we approach that change from one regime to another. So regardless of what we might think of the current administration, regardless of how much we might hate them, again, if we go and repeat history, we might be making the same mistake that we did in the last 40 years or more. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes that I have is present 3 options that I think the international community has on way forward for Afghanistan, with a little bit of a historical touch to it, in order of my least to most preferred options, and try to touch upon pros and cons of each one very briefly because time is short, and of course I'd be happy to follow up with more details. So what are the 3 options? I'll start with the first one, which I think is the easiest one. If it is not obvious, I'm going to spell it out. Do nothing. Yes, that is an option. Do nothing. Leave things the way they are. Well, we have done that for the last 14 months. Why can't we do that forever? It is the easiest option. You don't need military might. You don't need dollars. You don't need foreign aid. You don't need to send in your people. Peace of mind, right? Yes, but let's look at the look at the cons. What price are we going to pay if we continue status quo? I can think of at least two things that come on top of my mind. The first one being human suffering. Afghanistan had more than 2/3 of poverty even before the Taliban takeover. So for those people who might think everything was rosy before 2001, reality check. And now predictions say that it is close to universal. Almost everybody's in poverty. We have heard of people selling their daughters to be able to feed the rest of the family. We have heard of starvations. The news that came out right after Taliban took over of a family of all the kids in Kabul, literally starving to death, and later on being discovered by folks around them. If that is not shocking, what will it take for us to open our eyes? And since then, people have been dying. Even people who were well-to-do before, because of our policies, because of what we do, because of us holding on to the $9 billion of Afghanistan's money, people who were otherwise well-to-do do not have access to their own funds. People are not getting paid. Teachers could go to school all they want, but there is no pay. So the human suffering is huge. The next one, which I think is a consequence of what is happening right now, is the risk to global peace, regional peace, and of course, local peace. What happens to the youth who were born in the last 20 years, who did at least 12 years of schooling and more, and what is the future waiting for them? Nothing to do. Nowhere to go. It is as if they are inside the pressure cooker, literally. The only place for them to turn to is, of course, violence, because that is the only employer that pays. And are we willing to pay a price for that? Do we want to repeat another 9/11, God forbid? No. So this is a time to prevent all those bad things from happening and not let the youth of today be hopeless. Give them something to hope for. Give them something that they can say, okay, I got something to do in the next 20 years and in the rest of my life. And of course, the third point, which is more of a minor point, but for some it could be major, for European countries in particular, mass migration, which for Afghanistan means brain drain. I don't know of any of my close friends and relatives who are not looking for ways to get out of the country, if they haven't already made it out of the country, that is. And what is the price that we're paying with that? Huge. So do nothing is not a viable option in case it is not obvious. What is option number 2? Military solution. Why would that be a good alternative? We know how to do this. We have done this before. We have a ton of experience, including in Afghanistan, and very recent, not even very old. And of course, we have experience around the world as well. We have the money, we have the dollars, we have the ammunition, we have the manpower, we have everything, right? Let's go topple this regime. Piece of cake. We can do it tomorrow. And if you're looking for a foot soldier, there is no shortage of it in Afghanistan. Of course, we have the National Resistance Front, which is in thousands right now, but that is because nobody is willing to pay them. You show them the dollars, and everybody's going to turn against the Taliban. So you won't have any shortage of it. We did that what? During the Cold War, didn't we? We can do it again. So not difficult. Very easy. We have the experience. We have the know-how. We have everything that we need. What is a con? It will not give us the results we hope for. And if you're still too naive to believe it will, I would suggest that you go and read some history. You don't even have to go too far. Just look at the last 20 years. What happened when we toppled one regime after another by force? At least since the day I was born. In the last 40-something years. So option 2, not a viable option. Then what is left? Well, this is the most difficult option because we don't have a lot of experience with this. There is not a lot of demand for it. It is not easy. It is difficult. We don't have a ton of books and pamphlets and OPIs and procedures and everything else on how to implement this. And that is called a difficult work of diplomacy. And that is working with, negotiating with people that you don't agree with. Because if you already agree, what is there to negotiate, right? What is there to work on? You agree. Life goes on, it's beautiful. But no, we have to have the courage to put aside hypocrisy, to talk real issues, to look at the issues head on and tackle it. Be realistic about it. Be genuine about it. Be real about it and come up with solutions one step at a time and stop talking about it, most importantly. We have been talking about it for 14 months. I will end with a quote from George Marshall that we have all heard before and loved it. The patient is thinking while the doctors deliberate. And if we, as a group, continue this deliberation, we will also be one of those same individuals who just talk and have no action. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very clearly setting out the options as you see them. I guess maybe I can come back to you with one question relating to your last point about what your third option, the pragmatic negotiation option. And in some ways it connects to my previous question about recognition. What's the substance of that negotiation in your view?
I think negotiation is definitely important. Diplomacy is important. The substance of it is also important. And we have also learned a lot in the last 20 years, not just with respect to how to work with people that we disagree with, which we had a lot of them in the previous administration, in case anybody forgets, but also on how to deliver aid, which I think is another important point. Because it is not just about working with the regime and recognizing them and having their embassies and consulates open around the world, then what? Yes, putting some conditionalities. We will recognize you, we'll do ABC if you do CDE, women's rights, girls going to school, more inclusive government, the list could go on and on, whatever we think is the most important. So carrot and stick. I think that is the easiest way. It is very programmatic, it is easy, and it can work. It has worked in the past. If we wait for the time when they become real Taliban 2.0, and they agree on everything, on every principle, on every value that we believe in, then they have no reason to negotiate with you, other than, of course, the need for financial support.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And even as we're continuing this discussion, whether if you or others, other panelists have an idea of, what is in a sense, you're talking about a deal, a series of deals, a pragmatic approach. Yeah. If people have reflections on what's the substance, what are the elements of that deal, the outcome, the expected or hoped for outcome of such a negotiation, where it would get us to a better place, that would be wonderful. So I'm going to turn now to my friend Arne Strand in beautiful Bergen, Norway, for your introductory remarks. Go ahead, Arne.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me into this discussion. And secondly, for already having presented some of the arguments I was planning to make. So I think I'm going into it more from a governance and development aid perspective, because then I think I can touch upon some of the questions that you raise here. The question of what kind of diplomacy should we use? Is it a loudspeaker diplomacy or is it a teacup diplomacy? But let's start on the governance side, because to many it seemed like it was a big surprise that there suddenly was a Taliban-led government in Kabul. But if you take a closer look at this government has been in function for a number of years. This is what Fatima related to as well. This was what people were meeting in the countryside. They had a structure, they had a shadow government, they had governors in place in most of the provinces. What was new here is then with the escape of the heads of the Islamic Republic, this governance structure was then merged with and imposed a new leadership on a kind of a combined types of governance. But important to keep in mind here, those who came on top, even if a lot of them had experience from before, were all male. They were primarily Pashtuns, and they were primarily with a religious education, not the kind of technical education that we found in the previous government. And we all noted that there was an absence of a Ministry of Women Affairs. The Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission were no longer in place, and they rather prefer to strengthen the Ministry of Vice and Virtue than those ministries that really had made a difference from a lot of Afghans over time. But I'm saying this because it was not something that just changed overnight. It was something that a lot of Afghans had experienced from a long time. And this Taliban government was also then what the UN and the NGOs had been relating to for a number of years. It might be a reflection, but I hope my colleagues can comment on that. But to me, it also looked like it was a kind of a loss of the diplomatic section of the Taliban. Because when we saw what they had projected, it was the Taliban 2.0 would be, from their point of view, very different from what actually came in later. And I assume that part of that explanation is that it was seen as the military that won. It was not the diplomats that ended up in a negotiated situation. And finally, it was reclusive Amir in Kandahar that then somehow took control over the institution. And somehow this is part of the challenge, which I will come back to then. How do you then relate to such an organization? Colleagues have very clearly covered the dire humanitarian situation, development situation, and this was nothing new. Poverty started to increase already from 2012. Corruption was a major factor, and corruption was also a major factor why the previous government imploded. One thing was that there was less development, but people had lost trust in their government, and they didn't stand up to actually fight for it, as comparison to what we see in Ukraine now. But to me, this whole moral dilemma of the failures we did, accepting this to continue for so long time, and that we sit with 40 million Afghans now that have not chosen their own government and is at the moment the world's third most fragile state, ranking high on all indicators of poverty. To me, it's a commitment we have to take further. And we can't just say that we can't do anything. We need really to do it. And then the question is, what can we do? And is there any ways around actually going into a dialogue with the Taliban here? And I have 3 reasons why I think that's reasonable. And some of them have already been mentioned before. 40 years of suffering is enough. Numbers of Afghans killed, numbers of lives wasted, the psychosocial stress that people are living under today. Reverting to the military means, as I fully agree on, I'm not sure either if it will unseat the Taliban, but I know it will increase the suffering of the Afghan population. I know it will limit opportunity to work on any of the aspects that we are concerned about today. And my fear is that it will really strengthen both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Khorasan, as they will be giving more room to operate on. They did not only relate to the Taliban history, they related to a lot of the former warlords. They might have safe havens there that is not what we want to for the future. And I don't think either there is call it a viable military political opposition that can replace the Taliban at the moment. They are too fragmented. And the dilemma is that those who would like possibly to come back from the previous government is not welcome. Some of them have more blood on their hands than the Taliban had. So it's not an option there. We need something new. We need distinct Afghans as those on the panels. We need a youth that can form a third alternative to it all. And the third concern I have is that due to the sanction now, it's primarily humanitarian assistance and a bypassing of the Taliban administration that has been prioritized for the last year. To me, that is unsustainable band-aid, and it's extremely costly. We need a shift towards development assistance to be able to address the underlying causes of poverty and fragility. and to create a room to discuss rights and the rights to assistance. We need, I'm afraid to say, we need to go back and build the capacity of this de facto administration on the technical skills, not only for this administration, but for the future of Afghanistan. And if we ask the Taliban to take more responsibility for their own population, they need to have the resources to do so. And thirdly, and that's also been talked about, we need to see to that restriction on the banking sector is taken off, just to allow the Afghan private sector to operate as they could and should, and be as innovative on that as they have seen them over history. But that, how do we do this then when there is such a lack of trust and confidence between the Taliban leadership and the international community? Because both sides have to make concessions. There's no way around it. But I think the Taliban leadership will find this difficult as to give in to international demand, as seeing as giving in to those who somehow they have been able to throw out of Afghanistan again. And for the international community, giving in to Taliban is seen as violating the basic principles of securing rights of Afghans. So it's a really dilemma that need to be resolved. But I think Fatima and I both spoke to it. There are very much internal differences within the Taliban on a lot of these issues that come out in public. And more important, there are extreme resistance in the Afghan population against some, not all, of the policies of the Taliban as well. And I think the Taliban leadership, and those I've spoke to in the outskirts of that, is fully aware of these things. They see there need to be a change. Otherwise, the population will turn against them. So what do you do then when sanctions refrain international top leadership to talk to the Taliban? When the Taliban leader is put himself in Kandahar, not somehow being willing to talk, well, then we need to talk with those willing to talk. And that's where development assistance, to me, can come in, and discussion on how aid can be distributed, because it's a technical issue. It's an issue that everybody agree on that needs to be resolved. We have seen already how this happened locally. There are a lot of higher education going on for girls in some of the provinces where there's a large demand for it, and where local Taliban governors are actually listening more to the population than to the leadership. There are progress on women working in the NGOs. There are slow progress, but this leaves us with an option of thinking bottom up, rather than to first have a negotiated political solution that then will be implemented, because that sits too hard today. So it takes time, it goes slowly, but it could be a way of exploring ways where you work bottom up, work with the administration that is, ensure that you move into more development-oriented assistance, that you bring the Taliban administration on board, making them responsible for their own population, not only law and order. And this required dialogue. It required a lot of teeth, and it required people meeting eye to eye. And it required patience on both sides, and it needs to build a degree of trust that is lacking today. Then probably it also needs from both sides to say that, okay, if I move ahead with this, you need to come back with something that we can see the benefit of on our side. So it is challenging, but this is what Afghans are good at. So probably to a large extent, we should leave this to the Afghans and not try from the outside to enforce a solution upon the Afghans again, as we have tried for a number of years before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another compelling analysis. Maybe I could ask you, Arne, just to unpack a little bit, or to clarify a bit more the concessions that you see as the most important concessions from the Taliban side. I mean, the clear concession from the international side would be recognition or working with the Taliban government. Maybe there are other concessions you're thinking about on the international side, but what would you see as the most important things that you would want to see in this kind of diplomatic engagement? Where does it end up with, what are the things that the Taliban does that it's not currently doing that you would prioritize?
No, I think for my discussions with a lot of people, this with girls' education seems to be the big red line. Now, and the Taliban also need to come forward. If they had made a decision allowing girls to actually go back to school, all ages, that would have been extremely good starting point for them to indicate that they are on a negotiation track and they would like to come forward. But if that's happening, then the international community also have to say that, but this is excellent. Now, what are the next thing we can discuss? What are the things that we have in common? We are all concerned about climate change in Afghanistan. Is the Taliban government concerned about that? Yes, but they don't have the resources for it. We are all concerned about terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. Now, what can we do about that? Where can they actually do something? Do they need some support for that? We are all concerned about the quality of education. Now, how long will it take for the Taliban before they can start to take over the financial responsibility? Because they, as us, to use the term, are concerned about the aid dependency. So there are a number of hooks here where I see an opportunity for common concerns that could be turned into a discussion on solutions. And maybe not saying that, well, from tomorrow, you need to resume the full responsibility for all the service provision in Afghanistan, but for how long time can we work together and gradually shift the responsibility over? It is a kind of recognition that they are the de facto government, but I don't see any other government actually to do that kind of negotiation with today that has a national coverage and to some degree a national control. So finding the hooks, finding the things to discuss.
Thank you. And I'll turn now to Sima Samar, and you may not remember this, but you actually, or know this, but you actually participated in the founding event for CIPS in 2007 on Afghanistan when this Center for International Policy Studies was created. So it seems fitting to be speaking to you again in a CIPS event. Thank you for continuing to share your insight. Thank you for all the work that you've been doing and will undoubtedly continue to do. I'll turn it over to you now for your opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I think most of the issues, the points already said. And I remember that I was in that meeting or conference or workshop, I think. First of all, I think in my personal view, I think we have to look at as Fatima Jan said, that we have to look to the mistakes that we all committed in the past, and we have to learn from those mistakes. And we all know that the failure in Afghanistan is a collective failure. It's not only the Afghan government or Afghan people, but it's also, of course, the international community in their approach to the Afghanistan case. I'm saying that it is collective failure. Of course, we as an Afghan, we bore the main responsibility. And that was unfortunately not there. And why? Because of 44 years of war, because of the invasion of the Russian, because of the repetition of the history, not the invasion of the Russian. When I see now what they do in Ukraine, is remind me of their action, because I'm older than at least those, to remember those days, what they did. The sad part in Afghanistan was that the technology was not as advanced as it is today, so most of the issues were not documented. And everybody was trying to not really raise the issues and the crimes that the Russian committed in Afghanistan. So if the war become proxy and the other who involved in Afghanistan and tried to support the Afghan resistance against the occupation of the Russia, they made a mistake. They had a short-term strategy. One, I think they used the religion as a weapon of war. And that was a big mistake, and we see it today, not only in Afghanistan, but because the war in Afghanistan was anti-communism or whatever, focus on the religious and use the religion as a weapon of war. We had Al-Qaeda, now Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, Taliban, everything is the outcome or the mutation of Al-Qaeda, I would say. So that is one of the problems. The second problem, I think, was that as soon as the collapse of the Najib regime in Afghanistan and the collapse of USSR, then people lost the interest in Afghanistan. We see it in a way today in the same manner, unfortunately. This time is different because nobody wants to talk about their failure. They just want to ignore or kind of deny the issues in Afghanistan. I see it because there was a suicide attack in Kabul which killed and injured about 200 people, and it was also killing and murder of people in Indonesia in a sport ground. That was covered by American media, but not the suicide attack in Kabul, on the Hazaras specifically, on the minority. So we see that they try to somehow try to think or see or show that they don't see anything or they don't listen, they don't hear anything. The mistake in last 20 years of the government, one of the problem was corruption that we all know. Unfortunately, corruption was widespread, and it was even on the election and the promotion of democracy in Afghanistan. And we always raised our voice very clearly. The second point was the continuation of the culture of impunity. The culture of impunity in Afghanistan continued for war crimes, crimes against humanity in Afghanistan by the Afghan government, by the Taliban, by the international forces. Now some of the cases are coming up. It depends, some countries committed more and some countries committed less. And lack of promotion of accountability and justice to end the culture of impunity. Actually, the other point that had a very negative impact on Afghanistan was invasion of Iraq, because the whole attention diverted to Iraq, and then what? In Afghanistan, we had Al-Qaeda, in Iraq, we had ISIS. Nobody can deny this. This is, again, one of the biggest mistakes that we did, and the international community did, and the attention went to Iraq. I remember when I was talking with Condoleezza Rice on that long ago in 2002, begging, please establish a democratic society, a good democratic country system in Afghanistan to be a good example of your intervention, rather than going to Iraq, because in Iraq, it's not only the destruction of the whole system in Iraq, but that's another issue that I'm not going to talk, but to encourage the young Muslim men unemployed by terrorist groups. We see it, and nobody can deny that. And that was really something that we lost. Corruption, nepotism, exclusive opinion and ideas, including during the promotion of democratic system in the country. If you look at the election commission, election complaint commission, and holding the election, how much fraud was involved and how much corruption was involved on those issues. So of course, you facilitate the environment for collapse. So, and then of course, the running away of our president, who was bluffing that he's willing to be killed there, shocked all of us. Me, I personally am still in shock of that kind of action, what he said and what he did actually. So, and then Taliban, I think Fatima Jan can speak more about this. Are Taliban willing to talk? Because we should not forget that it was not started in 2018. It was started long ago. Arna do know this. When they started in 2010, everybody was trying, every country was trying to bring in talk with Taliban. I remember I asked Qaeda, I said, have you seen the Taliban leadership? He said, yes, but not really the top leadership, the second level of the Taliban. So that's why they gave 5 Taliban from Guantanamo to exchange to that American soldier or officer in Afghanistan. So it is all started from that time. Are they willing to talk or not? If they are willing to talk, why they didn't talk to the Afghan delegation Afghan government delegation for almost 1.5 years? Maybe that was lack of proper management by the president, and I clearly say that he was not able to manage the whole peace talks in Doha. Number one. Number two, I think the mistake was also that Afghan dialogue should be purely Afghan dialogue. I think that is any conflict requires mediation. We did not have a mediator. Khalilzad was not mediator. Khalilzad was trying to build a personality for him, and maybe to get the Nobel Peace Prize from Norway. Arna, it's going to you. So that is the reality in Afghanistan. And as previous speaker said, we should push the Taliban to that extent to convince them to talk. But I'm afraid, honestly, and I do believe on the science and physics, that when there's action, there'll be reaction. I was witness when the people of Afghanistan start to fight against the coup d'etat regime and the USSR with stone, with sticks, and few old shotguns. I remember my district, or the district that I born, was freed by sticks, maybe 3-4 shotguns that some family had. It was fallen to the hand of the so-called that time freedom fighter. Later on, they become more corrupt and involved and become the tool of our neighboring countries and different other systems. So the last point, I'm not going to take a lot of time. I think education is really key, but good quality of education. We should not forget that the denial of education to Afghan children in Pakistan and establishing these madrasas. These children was taken from the camp. I was working in the camp as a medical doctor. These children were taken from the camp they brought up in complete isolation from their mothers and their family. Brainwashed. These are the ones who came out of those madrasas. So it shows the importance of education, bad or good, that's a different issue. But their formal education and good quality education was ignored or denied by the international community. Now we have to push for a quality education. Of course, it's under Taliban, it might be not easy to have quality education because they already want to change the curriculum of the schools. But we also see the resistance in the country by those women who are educated. The difference between first Taliban regime and current Taliban regime is the level of education of the youth in Afghanistan. And somehow the resistance will build. I don't know how, but I just hope that it will not be a bloody, another internal war. And thank you.
Thank you very much. So I just want to invite everybody who's watching this event, you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to ask a few questions myself of the follow-up questions of all the panelists now, but then I'm going to be turning to any questions that there might be from you who are participating online. Perhaps I can go back to Fatima, and I suspect that a number of people watching this this event, including myself, don't really have a handle on what Afghan people are thinking right now. And I know that that's a huge question. We were talking about people in, rural Kandahar versus people in Kabul, different answers, and within the people, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big, wide question. But what's your sense about the attitudes within Afghanistan following these tumultuous events and the change of government? Obviously, people focused on their own well-being at a moment of human suffering. But can you characterize what you think the views might be among Afghans, please?
Thank you. It's a very important question. My first trip was totally different. My first trip was a little bit, probably a month after the changes. In the streets, it was much calmer, and but the appearance of people, especially women, was the same, and still is the same. They try very hard to look the way they used to, not the way that they were probably expected from the Taliban government. The first thing that, and I didn't go there as a tourist or just see my family. I went to see people, and I met lots of people, especially in my second trip. First of all, first trip was a shock. Second trip, people were talking. The poverty slowly started. People losing their jobs. Their savings were finishing. Even if they had something in the bank, it was very difficult or impossible to take. So the situation had changed. But one thing, everyone was saying that traveling inside Afghanistan has become much more easier. I mean, good friends from the past that they had important posts in the past regime that they are still in Afghanistan, they were happy that they could sit in their car and go to Herat or the other provinces, and they could see that the country is in one hand. But then when country is in one hand, you have expectation from one hand because there is no excuses. And those things that Mr. Dost was talking about, whether it is negotiation, whether it is diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy, or just diplomacy in general, and all that, then they don't have excuse. They can do it. That was one thing. The thing that the conversation with women, of course, everyone was very unhappy about the education, women's education. But that happens only in the governmental schools. The business was as usual in the private schools. It continues, not just in Kabul, everywhere. Those parts of the country which has no schools, they still don't have schools, but they don't have schools for the boys either. A question that you're asking came from a teacher, a female teacher. She said, suppose tomorrow, the Taliban says, okay, tomorrow every single boy can go to school. Who's going to finance it? Obviously, Taliban don't have money for it. Who is going to finance it? How do you send the money? How do you do it? Is it possible? How do you find teachers? Majority of female teachers have gone anyway, and most people, how do you practically do it? And she put something in my head that education cannot stop. You have to find a way for an alternative, parallel to pressure, negotiation, and everything until a formal education will come. This was one thing. The other thing that I asked most of these women, that was on my third trip. On my third trip, I had a huge group of women coming from other provinces, also not just Kabul. Doctors, professors, teachers, women engineers, and all that. Among all of them, I knew only two faces. which, Sima John, it's very rare for us. We usually know each other. And I asked that only 2 people I knew. One was the former employee of the Red Crescent, and one socially I knew from childhood. One doctor, a female doctor, turned to me quite angrily and said, because we are professionals, we were not activists. Where are you, the activists? Where are you? That was a shock. Exactly, where are we? So they say that now, if I demonstrate, I want to demonstrate on my own demand. You don't tell me. And if you open your mouth, or anyone else like you, open your mouth outside Afghanistan, listen to me and just talk about that. Don't make up stories for me, or just don't make flat platforms for yourselves while we are the majority, we are suffering inside. And this is the thing. When you talk about with the merchants, the traders, they're very happy because corruption is not there yet. We don't know. They say that from North Afghanistan, if they bring something, they just need to pay their tax and their trade will come. Yes, the trade is bad because of lack of money and no one buys anything and all that. So this is another thing. But that chain of corruption which existed shamefully, untolerated by the donors, that doesn't exist anymore. So there are few good things that one could build upon, but poverty, yes, a vague future for women, yes. Even if they say, okay, tomorrow the school is open, what kind of school, what do we do? It is vague. So this uncertainty is a huge problem for women. And re-emergence of Daesh is a huge problem for everybody, and especially for the Shia minority. I don't think they are minority. I mean, the Shia people of Afghanistan, that they are targeted, properly targeted. And I assure you, if this phenomena continues in Afghanistan and take roots in Afghanistan, the back of the barrel will be for the Afghans, the face of the barrel will be for every country around us and much beyond.
Sima Samar, you also talked about education as being key and good quality education. And you noted the resistance that exists among educated women now as a difference from previous periods. But you also raised the question: would the Taliban actually be willing to talk? Fatima has just talked about ways to think about women's and girls' education through informal means, but what is the pathway to restore good quality or establish good quality education, as you put it, particularly for women? What is the chain of events that you can imagine that would bring that about with whatever the international community, donors might do, people in Afghanistan might do, and what would be expected from the Taliban?
Well, I think I have to say that they, unfortunately, Taliban took the power, took the country, but they don't have a strategy for governance yet. And the news from inside Afghanistan shows, and even public news, is that they are really not yet understanding what to do for the country. I mean, they are still enjoying the victory, as so-called, instead of really focusing on the other issues. The official ban on the girls' education in some part of the country, in north part of the country, there are some girls' schools open from 7 to 12. Otherwise, they say that from 1 to 6 it's allowed, which was already and their first regime was also allowed. But there were no possibility, very, very, very limited number of girls going to school. although I was running a high school for the girls in one district, or the 3 district in Ghazni, not further than that. I think they allow the private universities and private schools, but honestly, even in the private schools, the people cannot pay. In the private universities, they cannot pay. The small university where Fatima John knows and Arna also know that I started earlier, 10, 12 years ago, we had 2,200 students. Currently, we have only 747 something, because they cannot pay. Even for that 700, there is a lot of discount and a lot of some scholarship for the girls. I have to mention that Fatima John was one of the first who paid for the scholarship for some girls in that university. So the overall economical situation is such that the people cannot pay. If the donors pay, I think there's a possibility to run homeschools at better quality than what Taliban asked us to do. And also, it is possibility to run private schools and private universities with good quality education. I don't think even with their vice and virtue that they wear this white gowns and come to the university or to see other institutions, but they cannot control every corner of the country. They yet to find out who's who. If they have the normal police does the vice and virtue, or the vice and virtue will be specific police. They want to make like Sepah in Iran or what. So they are yet to finalize that, because they don't know where to put their foot soldiers and how to organize them in the Ministry of Defense or in the police section. But what they do know is to control women. All these decrees, of course, women, I mean, who resists those educated women? Although you see a lot of black dresses now in Afghanistan compared to the colorful dresses that everybody was wearing. And I, as a Minister of Women's Affairs, I started to wear different color in order to encourage the girls that we have more colors, not only the black and white, like Saudis or some other Arab countries, or Iran, unfortunately. So I think there is possibility, but it requires a strong political will. I mean, I hardly ask some friends to support. There's a small NGO in Canada who raised some money for the scholarship, but they cannot send it to Afghanistan. So how much we can say as I said before, the international community do not want to discuss the Afghanistan issues severely, because we have the Ukraine war currently, which is also create another humanitarian disaster everywhere, not only for the Ukrainian over there, for all the others around, the inflation because of the war, and the Nordic countries who are close to the
Thank you.
Aggressive neighbor.
Yeah, an aggressive neighbor. In fact, I want to ask Najim a little bit about Afghanistan and aggressive neighbors, because you did mention the potential challenge to regional peace. And unfortunately, as we know, Afghanistan has been the arena for great games of one kind or another for a very long time. One question I have for you is, how do you assess what the regional neighbors are responding to this new situation? And then there is a question that's come from somebody in the audience about the role of Pakistan in particular, talking about great games. And if you could comment just about what you see as how these players are all thinking about Afghanistan today and what the challenges are and potential risks to Afghanistan or opportunities as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Roland. We cannot ignore regional interests in peace and security inside Afghanistan. And of all the neighbors in the country, I would say the one that predominantly has the most important role, at least in my view, is our neighbor to the south and east, namely Pakistan. And the reason for that is also sort of obvious if you look at the historical context of the region. It goes back really, if you go real back, it goes to 1893, the Durand Line, which at that time Pakistan did not even exist. It was the competition between Tsarist Russia in the north and British India in the south, and that was a buffer zone, and that was the line that was basically drawn on a piece of paper that separated people, real people who would otherwise see themselves connected, Pashtuns and other groups in the region who were literally separated between the three countries, not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also Iran. And then, of course, comes the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan sort of taking on this disputed border as their national boundary. And not to mention the separation of Bangladesh a couple of years down the road, which made them even more sensitive to the loss of territory. And of course, the conflict in Kashmir with India further complicates this. So all of these little pieces of the puzzle turns Pakistan into a neighbor that is, if you were to think about it from their perspective for a second, concerned about their own existence, about their own continuity on the global map. So from that perspective, they would do anything, as anybody else would do if they were in their possession, to try to preserve their geography, their unity. And they've been trying very hard, sometimes to an extreme. So extreme as to helping in the creation of and supporting and training and funding directly of groups that one day are freedom fighters and then the next day are terrorists. And starting with the Cold War, these Mujahideen groups, and of course the Taliban, and until today, the leadership is very much in control of what is happening in the country. So looking at Afghanistan without considering what is happening in Pakistan would of course be a huge mistake. Some international policymakers have tried to promote that sort of a view. Others have dismissed it as saying the two are separate, but I think that is a gross oversimplification if you look at Afghanistan in isolation. Their interests also change over time because this is a dynamic game. This is not a static game where my interests and your interests are defined and we have opposition and then let's talk it out. No, it is not as simple as that. And of course, other neighbors, what happens in Iran becomes even more important. We also know, for example, that some of the leadership of the previous Mujahideen groups, they have resided in pretty much all the countries around us. They were not exclusive, their ties to Pakistan, including today. And it goes a little bit further than the circle, goes all the way to Turkey and Qatar and everywhere else. But of course, against Pakistan becomes the most important. I forgot the question. What is their role? Their role could be as constructive as you want it, or it could be as destructive as it has been going on in the last couple of decades. What we can do about it, I think, is to be honest and frank and open and have the courage to call a spade a spade. And also to look at things from Pakistan's perspective for a little bit, although that might be very unpopular, especially now in Afghanistan. Let's look at it from their perspective as well. Why have they turned into the arch enemy of Afghanistan? After all, Pakistan was a country who have been hosting millions and millions of Afghans, including myself, when I was there in the 1990s, 4 years, 4 decades. Other countries have not offered the same sort of an open arm, at least from a people perspective, to Afghans as have done Pakistan. So why this dichotomy? Why on the one hand, you would look at Pakistani people and say, brother, different mother. We love each other. We have a lot in common. We share common pains and suffering. The terrorism that hurts you also hurts me, and all of that good stuff. And then on the other hand, you look at the policies, you look at things that happen behind the scenes, and it is as destructive as anybody's arch enemy. Why? And what can we do about it? I think honesty, truthfulness, looking at things from their perspective, bringing them on the negotiating table, and not ignoring them would be part of the solution. I think ignoring them would be the worst mistake.
Thank you.
Can I add something here?
Please.
I think one of the problems between Pakistan and Afghanistan is that we do not acknowledge the problem exists in the country. In all the conferences on Afghanistan, Pakistan repeatedly said the same things, that they want a peaceful Afghanistan because of all the issues that they are saying every year. So I think when you talk about the negotiation with Taliban, you need to include Pakistan and acknowledge Pakistan and Afghanistan. They should come and acknowledge the problem exists between us, and then we have to solve it. We are in denial mood, and that is not going to help. It's just build on those denial and build on hatred and widen the gap between the two countries.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that there was explicit acknowledgement of Pakistan's destabilizing role in Afghanistan, both by the government in which some of you served and certainly by the United States and other Western countries. And it didn't seem to have much effect. And going forward, it's going to be difficult to know what kind of influence would be effective with Pakistan. But maybe think about that issue, and if others want to weigh in, please do so. Maybe I could just turn to Arne now, and with some other questions from the chat. Arne, you mentioned that the Taliban government was in effect the one that the UN and NGOs had been relating to for many years. We have one question, which is, what is the role of the UN in engaging in dialogue with the Taliban now? What's happening there, I guess, in relation to the UN dialogue, and what are the thoughts from panelists about the UN's impact or role? So if everybody could think about that, what's the UN role here? And then, without overburdening you here, Arne, I'm going to add another one, which is, what aid is actually making its way into the country, and how is it being used? Is more aid a solution to the plight of the people of Afghanistan, or would it be diverted? You want to take a crack at that, Arne, and then I'll ask others if they want to respond as well?
No, happy to do that. And just go back a bit to some comments to what's being just discussed, if I can just do that, because I think it's correct. I think Sima bringing it up, that this Taliban government do not have a strategy. That's something that has become out so clear in a lot of my discussion, including with people who used to be part of the former government, and that's their concern. Now, if we turn that around, that might be an opportunity to ask them for what is the strategy, what would be a good strategy, how do you foresee, what is the role of an Islamic emirate when it comes to providing support for your own population? Now, if they haven't thought about that, maybe that's the time that they start to think about it. But to me, that's one of the opportunities, rather than to acknowledge that that's something that's not developed. There's probably not an agreement on all of that internally, but that is the discussion they need to take if they want to be the government for Afghanistan. And I just add a bit on the role of Pakistan as well, because I think we also need to acknowledge that the former Afghan government was not totally innocent in their support to the Pakistani Taliban, and maybe not either some movements in Balochistan. So it was a tit for tat going on, and that was also then forming part of the whole conflict and the lack of willingness to talk on these issues. Behind this are strong military forces, intelligence agencies, and all of that then were competing on interest in Afghanistan as well. So the more of this we can bring up and discuss it, the better. But no one is innocent in this game, just to put that out. The role of the UN, sorry. The Security Council, despite the international disagreement between Russia and the US and China included, has actually agreed upon an extended mandate for UNAMA, the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan. And they have also an extended mandate on monitoring human rights situation. So they are in a good position to actually be a kind of joint channel for discussion. They should be in a good position for joint channel with talking with the Taliban. But this goes for a certain level of discussions as well. Then comes the more specialized agencies that then are running a parallel channel, but to implement projects, they also need to talk to the technical ministries. So it is a kind of not recognition, but recognizing that we need to talk, and recognizing that the UN, although they are channeling the funding from the international community and the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund that was set aside, they need the assistance of the international and Afghan NGOs and CSOs to actually implement the projects. And that talk to the second part of the question. Just saying that the arrangement is then extremely vulnerable because it will require continued international support for it. And that is probably then being part of negotiations relating to issues in, not least, Ukraine. So it's a fragile structure as it is. Now, my concern is what kind of aid are we talking about? Are we talking about humanitarian assistance only? That has been the primary things, or could we talk more about, not least, support for education? The European Union was out early and have continued to support educational support, which I think is extremely important. And then the question comes, how can we trust the UN agencies? How can we trust the NGOs when we already spoke about the issue of corruption, possibly Taliban trying to divert some of it? To me, the answer goes back to what extent can we bring in the Afghan communities? Because my concern is to establish a completely separate aid system where you are not asking the Afghans what they need or what they would prioritize, but you are from the outside deciding if there is to be an assistance, what type of assistance, and who it should be delivered to. So there are a lot of opportunities to control it if we allow the Afghans on the ground larger influence here. This has been the same for the last 40 years. We have overlooked it, and it has been painful experience. But there is a way to control it if we allow the Afghans to a larger degree to control it. But this comes also then with a dilemma. If we say to the Taliban administration that they need to take responsibility for their own people, and then we say, but you should not at all hold an influence how assistance is made. This is where we need to talk. This is where there need to be a kind of dialogue. And whatever failure that came out of the meeting in Oslo, I think this was one of the positive things where NGOs and civil society actually started to talk with the Taliban. If that is continued, I hope so. I know it's continuing at the provincial level and at the district levels where they are much closer and where it's much easier to find a solution. But this is the challenge then at the policy level, also because of the sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Najim, do you have thoughts on this? And then we'll go to Fatima.
Sure. I was specifically interested in the question on the effectiveness of foreign aid and whether more aid will be the solution. At a theoretical level, there is, of course, these two camps. One that argues for a big push strategy, that if you pump large enough sums of money into a country, all of a sudden, by magic, boom, development will happen. And then on the other hand of extreme, you have more incremental approach to aid, that development is difficult, it's challenging, you have to change one thing at a time, and it has to be more appropriate. And if it is not obvious, I am pro the second group. Partially because in Afghanistan, we already saw what too much money can do. A country that at max, we have had what, a GDP of $20 billion. There have been years where we have spent more than 5 times that amount in Afghanistan. How can you possibly justify that? How can you possibly expect aid to be absorbed at that rate? No wonder we had mass scale corruption. No wonder we had highly ineffective aid. So if you want aid to be effective, more aid never does development make, just as military intervention alone does not get rid of the kinds of problems that we have seen in places like Afghanistan. So I think what is important will be more incremental, targeted, effective aid. And there is no shortage of literature on this. We know everything from the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness to tons and tons of literature until today. I think the real problem is more on the implementation side of things. And one of those principles is managing for results. Every time when we talk about aid in Afghanistan, what do most people talk about? What is the top 2 indicators that they talk about? Dollars of aid dispersed. That is an input indicator. And at most, you might want to correlate it again back to GDP levels, not even growth. Well, of course, if you put a lot of money in, you get a lot of money out. Did it do anything in the process? No, you have to look for results. You have to look at the outputs, but more importantly, outcomes. As Sima was earlier talking about it, even sending 6 million girls to education to schools for 2 hours a day with barely minimum number of supplies around them, with teachers who are not trained sufficiently and do not have access to materials, sitting on maybe sometimes in schools where you don't even have chairs and equipment and you're hungry on the inside and worried about 25 million things you have to do right after you leave school because you have to make some money, you can't possibly call that education. So it is about the quality. It's about how you spend that money. I think this is the perfect time because this could put Afghanistan back on the road to self-reliance. A little bit of targeted, output-oriented and outcome-oriented aid would go a long way.
Thank you, Fatima, and then Sima.
I can't agree more. I was going to say that pumping so much money in such a short time and no check and balance, what do you expect? I want to talk quickly about a few things. The role of the UN. Now it is the main role. It is the central role, and everything, whether it is the NGOs work or anything, engagement with the Taliban's government, everything goes through UN. So that's why I mean every country should help and interfere in the work of, I mean, positive interference in the work of UN, that we cannot have it, I mean, miss it, the situation again. We must not make mistakes. We cannot afford the mistakes. I go back quickly to the question that Sima had put, that why Taliban didn't work in Doha, that we expect them to talk now. What has changed? First of all, the reason number one that a proper conversation didn't start in Doha, because we didn't have, as it was mentioned earlier, without a mediator. How could you? I mean, how could it be possible in the history of human negotiations, just a political negotiation, let alone a peace negotiation of 44 years of war, to have it without a mediator? This was a dream. A mediator cannot be someone. A mediator is a person who has experience, and he's trained or she's trained for that specific job. And this person has to be trusted from both sides. The other thing, I go back to what I said, that the message came to us, the team of the Republic team and the team of the Taliban, the message was different. The Taliban were, from day one, you could see that they know that the Americans are leaving, and they were sure that militarily they will win. And what we did, the Republic side, every morning we gave them an excuse on a silver platter. First of all, it was our idea. Not having a mediator was the genius president's idea that we should not have. Second, it was rules of procedures. 3 months we were talking about rules on procedures. This was not Taliban's idea, because Taliban had talked with the Americans, with the mediator, in a not very long time with the Americans. So they were used to it. We gave them those things. And the last mistake and the most important mistake was that when they came, the Taliban came and offered the Constitution of 1964, that it was refused. With the Constitution of 1964, voting and election would have been rescued. The flag, which is very important for us, would have been rescued. The institution remained. Now, when I talk with my colleagues, they say, "Oh, they were bluffing." Why didn't we call their bluff if it was bluffing? And then, if in front of the whole world they came with that offer, had we accepted that offer, so what excuse they would have? And the last thing, it was no one is innocent. This is absolutely true that no one is innocent. When the money of those countries that they are democratic countries was used to help the Taliban of Pakistan, or used for the or the rebels of Balochistan, why were they silent? They didn't say, "Why do you do with my money? Why do you do these things with my money?" And then an animosity, as Mr. Dost said, that animosity with a country which we have millions of people still living there, and they could play a positive role. What was the use of this animosity? And all of a sudden, brotherhood and everything. Not this, not that. They are neighbors, and we have to negotiate what is good for both sides. And the corruption was the worm which ate the pillar of this republic. And it was systematically ignored by the donors. Why on earth, for God's sake? Why?
Sima Samar, please.
Yes, I fully agree what Fatima Jan said about the corruption in the aid money. But I would say that the humanitarian aid, humanitarian relief program is must for survival, but that can be also designed properly. I mean, it's 1 year or 14 months past. Last year was, we were always in emergency, unfortunately, as long as I remember, from 44 years of conflict in the country. But for this year, they should have had a proper program and insist on the inclusion of women, at least to for the planning, for distribution, and for receiving aid, of course. The second point on the aid issue is that the aid should not be always hand over a bag of wheat or a bottle of oil. It should be more than that. They could plan and make a policy or a program to do some work for food for work projects, rather than giving free relief distribution, because it depends people. It really make them more passive citizen for the country, rather than an active citizen of the country. But by saying this, it is not only, I mean, the humanitarian relief is not the solution. We need to put pressure, political pressure, in order to change a little bit and make the environment a little bit open for different opinion and ideas.
Can I actually just jump in right there, because I'm conscious about how much time we have, and what you just said relates to some questions that we have about different opinions and ideas. And let me just grab this moment to continue with you, Sima Samar, and just to put some of these questions relating to that point, because we have a number of questions talking about the prospects for a more broadly based government in Afghanistan. We have Grant Kippen, whom all of you will know, asks, with respect to governance, could the speakers comment on who they think will represent or speak for the issues and concerns of Afghans, rural and urban Afghans going forward? Is this the sole responsibility for the Taliban leadership, or is there a potential role for broad-based inclusive political parties? A related question from Andy Tamas. What can the international community do to foster the endogenous processes needed for sustainable, contextually appropriate nation building in Afghanistan? And then another couple of questions from a PhD student at the University of Leeds. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your name because I'm afraid I will mispronounce it. So my apologies in advance. But what about the prospects for some kind of power sharing is the essence of that person's questions. So there's a whole set of questions about broader based government. Is there any hope for that? And how would it happen in practice?
I
Sima.
think I think the international community has to put pressure on Taliban to convince them to come for an interim government or transitional government, 2 years, 3 years, something that could prepare the environment for really an election. I mean, learning lessons from the previous election, Kippen is there, and we know how much we suffered from the corruption and fraud in the election together, actually. And so that can be one issue. Broad-based government doesn't mean that we should have or put the previous Mujahideen leaders or the people who already the Afghans has experience with them back to the position. But they are capable, should be technically qualified people in order to enable Afghanistan to go forward, to run the country. One of a friend gone to Afghanistan and said that the Taliban is bringing their deputy minister and saying that you train it in 3 hours to be a deputy minister. That is not possible. So I think that, in my personal view, that can be one of the policy. There's no doubt that we are very much divided, unfortunately, and we were all in shock, to be honest. At least I'm still in shock. So I don't know about the others. But I do feel that we slowly come up and try to have ourselves, to put ourselves in a place and think that what should we do? Back on the aid and the UN role, I think UN can really play a strong role, but she now as a SRSG in Afghanistan, Rosa, she needs political and financial support in order to enable her to maneuver. And that is really from the SG himself and all of his cabinet, whatever he has, all of his team, and also the countries who are involved in Afghanistan. At least it should be frank discussion with China and Russia and the US that let's put Afghanistan aside of Ukraine conflict or any other interest between them, or Taiwan conflict. But I think it's not easy, but it is possible if there's a honest approach to the case. If we really want a peaceful world, not only peaceful Afghanistan, and based on human rights and based on human dignity.
Thank you.
It's a wish, very ambitious wish, but I think it's possible if we have the will, the political will to do it.
Thank you. I'm very mindful of the time here. So I'm going to ask all the panelists at this point going forward to, I'm going to ask at least one more grouped question from the chat, from the Q&A. And I have a feeling that, that several of you will want to respond, but I would ask you to respond as briefly as you can, although that might be hard because these are pointed questions and they come back to the real dilemmas of pursuing the pragmatic strategy that you're all advocating. One question goes to Arne Strand. What do you mean by leaving? What do you mean by leaving for Afghans? That is allowing Afghans to define their own way forward, I think, while we are seeing that the Taliban kill whoever opposes them. And then there's another question, which is, I guess, to Sima and Najim, which is, What are the options to stop the systematic killing of other ethnic groups like Hazara? So, I mean, this gets at the kind of real challenge, I think, for dealing with a regime that is capable of that kind of brutality. Really, how do you think this through? I mean, what is that answer, that practical question? How do you stop the systematic killing of other ethnic groups like the Hazara? Anyway, toughly put questions, but I think that they're fair questions. So I'll turn to Arne first.
No, this is a major dilemma and one I've been faced with it several times while working in Afghanistan. My first meeting with it was the victims of the Afghan massacre. Hazaras killed by Tajiks and Pashtuns led by Ahmad Shah Massoud and Sayaf. So the whole point that my big concern, and that goes for the psychosocial effect of war on people, is how can you revert? How can you find different means than actually using violence against your opponents? Because some have been consistently targeted, but they have not been consistently targeted by one group. They have been targeted by all groups. There is very few that don't have blood on their hands, and that is a dilemma. But that's why I'm talking about this long-term solution, because I fear that anyone coming from the outside and telling the Afghan, this you need to do, that will backfire. How can you actually, and now I'm talking local communities as well, because even if a conflict is resolved at the national level, there are all these conflicts that has been able to build up after 40 years of conflict that needs to be addressed. And you can work on that even if the central conflict is not being addressed. So in Afghanistan, you need both, but then people need to talk. And I think someone said earlier on, you need to talk with your enemy, because those are the only one that you need to make an agreement with. I know it's not easy. And I think the point taken about having a neutral mediator is also extremely important in this. But then that has to be someone that is trusted by both parties. And I think a big dilemma would be, can we place that mediation in Afghanistan then? Because otherwise, I am not sure if you trust any of the neighboring countries to host those talks. And that has to be part of an intra-Afghan discussions. But I'm convinced on the other side that although there are a lot of political leaders that have not the trust, there are a lot of young Afghans that is about to gain the trust because they can present a different alternative. There are elderly Afghans with huge respect that has not been part of the political processes, but are seen as respected Afghans. To me, the future is more here than in the political parties. I think we should also remind ourselves that we were part of a system that rejected political parties at the time when the constitution was discussed, an election system. So it's also that we need to be a bit careful on what we say that you need to get back to, especially if that has failed.
Thank you, Arne. I'm going to now turn to Najim and then Sima, and we're going to end with Fatima since you started us off, Fatima. And if you, I'm sorry for doing this, but I'm looking at the time. If you could keep your remarks 2 minutes or less on a really tough question. And I'm also going to invite you to add any last points that you want to make. So like 2 minutes to do all of that, it would be a miracle, but you try your best, and then I'll turn to Sima and then to Fatima.
I will try. At the risk of being misunderstood, I will try to be as brief as possible. Couple of points. Power sharing. I think we have had an experience with it. We saw it in the last decade especially, and we saw the results of it. In short, it was not very productive. I think part of the problem with presidential systems in general is that concentration of power. And the moment without, let's say, a parliamentary system or a little bit more decentralized power sharing system, you can't really solve that problem by having a more inclusive government, quote unquote, where there is diffuse responsibility. Whatever is not working, well, it's not me, ask the other guy. Second one, on the international community's role and how they can help, especially mediate or peace or development. I think this is the perfect example of more effective and targeted aid. Just a few days back, I was hearing Taliban reps talking about the fact that they're not necessarily opposed to girls going to school. They're just not ready enough for it. And they were hinting at developing some sort of a budget as to what it would cost to send girls to school. I think we as the international community should at least for once say, okay, we may not agree with everything you say, girls going to school separate from boys, no co-ed, they have to have their own transportation, they have to go in this region, not in that region. Although we might disagree, at least it is a starting point that girls will be able to go to school. And this will be our chance to say, all right, show me your budget. How are you going to spend this money if I give it to you? And will you actually send girls to school? And if you do, here is conditional cash, $1 at a time, not literally.
Thank you for making those excellent points and for keeping within your time. Sima Samar, please.
Yes. Well, thank you. I think a few points that I would like to mention. One, I think the human rights values should be taken seriously, and we should also treat Afghans as a human with the rights that we are all talking about. The human rights is not exclusively Western values, it's a human value, and everybody should be treated that way, including Afghans. The human rights values and principles will unite more Afghans, decrease the gap between the, let's say, who's the big brother and who's the smallest brother. The second point on the how can we stop the attack on the Hazaras? With accountability and justice. If not by of course, not by the Afghan government or Afghan judiciary system, but by international mechanisms. If we really want to end the culture of impunity, that will help not only in Afghanistan, it will help in non-regional countries and government. And it will help also in the other continent to set a good example of the international mechanism intervention in Afghanistan on promotion of accountability and justice. Otherwise, okay, there is attack on Hazaras, we cry for a few days and then we forget. Next week there's another attack, and that is not, as Arna said, it's not new, and that should not be seen as okay, these are Afghans and they do this and they cannot be better than that, and they do not understand the human rights. The third point that I would like to mention, we need mediation and international support, but the international community should listen to the Afghans, not come with the pre-cooked cake for us. Let us choose the sugar and the amount of flour and oil in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're making me hungry. Fatima, please.
In short, if I'm the donor countries, Western countries in general, if you ask me that, what should you ask? I mean, I think they should not scatter their demands. Their demands should concentrate on the promises that the Taliban made in Doha, repeated in Rome in the special representatives conference, again repeated in Geneva, and very eloquently after the fall of Kabul, repeated by Mr. Mujahid as their representative and their spokesperson. And each time they made it very clear, this is not my word, this is the word of the supreme leader which has come. So I would just concentrate that women, human rights, everything is concentrated on that. And this is the promise they have made. So this is number one. If Simojan is very right, I mean, the solution is an interim period. But the interim period in Doha was stopped by Mr. Ghani because interim period meant goodbye. We have someone neutral there. Now also they are in power. It will be very difficult for them to convince them to have an interim period. Although I agree that this is the only solution for a new start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are so many questions that participants entered into the Q&A that we haven't been able to get to, and I really apologize to the attendees of this meeting. It's, I think, a sign of how engaged people are who are listening to this discussion. And in fact, one of the last questions isn't a question, it's a statement. And the statement is, really, really interesting panel. Thank you for organizing, and thank you to the panelists for their expertise, thoughts, and honesty. And I can think of no better way myself to thank Fatima Gailani, Najim Dost, Sima Samar, and Anne Strand for bringing, for leading this very interesting conversation. And I would also, before I turn it back over to Nipa Banerjee to conclude the session, I would like to thank Nipa for organizing this event, for keeping this discussion going. Canada, many other countries, we have a continuing responsibility, frankly, for what's going on in Afghanistan, and for doing our best to respond to a very difficult situation. So thank you, Nipa, for organizing the event, and I think it was enlightening. Over to you. You're muted. You're muted, Nipa. Nipa.
I'm sending her a request to unmute.
Sorry about that. What a rich discussion. I thank Roland Paris for conducting such a lively dialogue with our speakers. Roland Paris was closely involved and active in the Afghanistan file in the decade following Bond 2002. We are pleased to have a brilliant mind return to guide us. My heartiest thanks to the speakers for giving their precious time to this event. I'm grateful to Fatima and Sima for agreeing to join us at a difficult time they are going through. All of our best wishes will be with you on your journey. I thank the audience for participating. Unfortunately, we could not reach all of the concerns and issues raised, but we tried our best, and more than 2 hours cannot hold people's attention, so we had to stop. However, we think today's session is only a starting point. We will continue our studies. Today's speakers with long, deep, and direct experience in a leader background against which policy directions to address the multifaceted development, humanitarian, and security interventions can be considered. We look forward to meeting again to discuss more concrete, time-bound action plans for helping the Afghan people and preventing a destabilized Afghanistan. Thank you and goodbye.